Okay, welcome back, y'all. This is hopefully our last remote class. I really hope for this quarter, and I get to see your I would want to say shiny faces, but maybe your mask-clad shiny faces on Monday, which will be great. Today we're gonna do just a one-day little module on conservation planning and doing reserve design. And then we have the species labs are due today. If you still have any issues knitting those, I'll accept end of day today. Feel free to email with me or with any other problems. And then the communities lab, we'll have that due on Monday. And then this reserves lab will be due the following Wednesday. So it's kind of all piling up. But the nice thing is that we'll, these aren't really hard to complete. It's more just being able to understand the concepts, which I will review on Monday, and we'll really highlight like what we've done so far in anticipation of just a little midterm, and really this is a culmination of machine learning, really specific to like more, I would say, more traditional approaches to doing environmental data science. So, we did logistic regression with trying to predict where species are based on their environment and the relationship that we fit. And then we expanded to looking at multiple species across different sites with communities. And then now, and using these unsupervised ordination techniques. And now we're going to expand further to then say, well, okay, given what we know about these different sites and the range of these different species, how would you then take conservation action and have some, maybe you have a some sort of preserve area where you restrict human activities, whether it's hunting or fishing or other human uses. We're going to go over some techniques for doing that. And then we'll start into a new set of stuff after the midterm, which is really like more modern techniques using deep learning and these convolutional neural nets to get at more complex objects and detecting things like different species from just photos using the iNaturalist data set. And then we'll do go back to applying some basic supervised and unsupervised approaches with like random forest and clustering on satellite imagery with Google Earth Engine. And then we'll end with an expert panel. So I already confirmed Scott Laurie, who started iNaturalist, will be joining us and soliciting others. And then we'll do a module some justice thing too. So let's see. Let me look at, is there something that just popped up on Slack? Okay, so yeah, there's still looks like maybe some issues that I can address and be available once I go through the lecture and lab with anybody experiencing issues. Okay, so let's get into it with the conservation planning slides, and then I'll go into the lab. So there's a whole Bren class called conservation planning that goes into this stuff. And actually this class years back was how, apologies for the dump truck here, but this class was, gosh, that was 2012. I think I just helped out with it when I was all but dissertation, just hanging out at Bren. And that's how I first met Ben Halpern. And he gave a guest lecture and I was helping out with the labs. And we were using the software called MarkSan. And it's kind of changed. And I'll show you more of the latest. But fast forward, and it's 2020. There was a paper that Morgan Vasali, who was at the Benioff Ocean Initiative, co-led with myself. She did more of the writing, I did more of the analysis. And this was an example of trying to figure out, based on all the best available data that we have for the high seas, where is it that we would want to allocate some sort of restriction on fishing at the sea surface, along the sea surface, and then maybe mining at the sea floor for the high seas. So areas beyond national jurisdiction, which are in white. And this is part of an initiative, BBNJ, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction with the United Nations, and trying to promote conservation measures as the United Nations rewrites the law of the sea, which is what is controlling. It's the current law for the high seas, which is a little outdated, more akin to pirate days than modern good governance, especially considering how fluid the distributions are of these different species. So anyway, this was an effort to do that. And we used this prioritizer software that you guys are going to use in the lab to accomplish this. And then one of the things I'll be working on, hopefully in the coming weeks, is building a little Shiny app so that this can be used with some sliders to look at different priorities as we kind of go into more negotiations between countries with those talks. So you are using a decision support system. It's not necessarily making the decisions, but it will optimize those decisions. So this is just an old MarkSan slide. So this is the more traditional software. And this would be a little formula that it would try to optimize, where you have, and you'll see more of these slides. So if this doesn't make sense, don't worry now, but there's this idea of these different components and you're trying to optimize all of them simultaneously, which is each planning unit. So you'd subdivide your area of study. In this case, we use these half-degree cells, and then each area would have a cost associated with it. So if you think terrestrially, more traditionally, it would be, for instance, the cost of buying that property to exercise whatever action you want to, maybe exclude certain human activities. Or in the case of this example, on the high seas, it would be the cost of that we input was the amount of fishing that was predicted to occur, with actually some other, the Sustainable Fisheries group at Bren did a lot of that initial analysis. And then the boundary length modifier, this is another, well, before I talk about that, you would have these targets. So what species are you trying to conserve? And then there's some representation of how much of that species you would want. And if you don't meet that threshold, what's the penalty? So you're trying to minimize the cost, minimize that penalty, and then minimize, like, make it efficient, make it constrained with the boundary length. So reduce the perimeter of the set, the solution set, and you might have some other cost thresholds. So it used to be like the results used to be really hard to interpret, and it's because it would do this heuristic of trying all these different combinations and look for a global minimum. And this is, we're going to see more of this stuff when we talk about deep learning. But generally, when you're crawling a decision space, you're trying to, let's say, minimize some overall cost, then you can run into this problem where you find local minimum, but it's not the global minimum. So then you'll try to then change the input parameters, move around the space a little bit, and then find some more global minimum. But anyway, you get these results that were just really hard to interpret because it would show you like the number of times a given planning unit would then show up in running 100 different solutions. So anyway, all of that is to say, recently, this has been dramatically improved with this prioritizer package and really using this integer linear programming that actually arrives at an analytical solution, not a heuristic solution. And it's actually really interpretable with the functions and the arguments that you put into it, and you can solve it pretty fast. So I'm actually going to be just borrowing slides, and even the whole lab with all of its text is really just straight from Jeffrey Hansen. I made a few minor tweaks, but this is really his baby, and he is out of University of Queensland, where Hugh Possingham is based, and he's like the guru of conservation planning. And it was originally Marxan that was used to do, for instance, all the Great Barrier Reef marine protected area planning and conservation. And now this group is really they're the forefront. And these folks have been to the NCs many times actually over the years in doing conservation planning initiatives. So yeah, we've got this global biodiversity crisis, as you guys know, with the 6th great mass extinction with the age of the Anthropocene, and these are some critters that we don't necessarily see, like the dodo, anymore. And how do we save what we've got and do that within the constraints of all the humans living on the planet and all the extraction and things we do. So this is a map of protected areas, and then this is an extra slide I added with looking at protectedplanet.net. Here's where we're at with the status of protected areas. About 16% terrestrially, 8% marine. And if you count these other effective area-based conservation measures, which is a looser definition of protected area, then it's a little bit more. But we're a long ways away from what some of these other targets are out there. Like this, there's a science paper in 2019 that a Global Deal for Nature, where they really proposed this 30 by 30 or 30% by 2030. And there's been like $5 billion committed to getting there, including $1 billion from Bezos that just fell out of his pocket. And then there's other initiatives like the Half Earth Project that Edward Wilson, E.O. Wilson, who's also just like the godfather of biodiversity, who recently passed. and was based at Harvard. And he studied ants, but he really promoted all these really early ideas of biodiversity, and did some really cool studies about islands and understanding how conservation really works. So if we want to figure out like, well, what areas do we want to protect? There's this notion of features. So we have a feature, could be a species or a habitat, and then we're interested in conserving features. And so in order to kind of, figure out a plan, and we have to divide out the whole area according to some planning units. So that could be just like a regular grid. A lot of times it's you see hexagons because I think people just think they look cool. Hexagons do have some functional use as far as a shape goes if you're considering looking at directional flows, because each side is equidistant to the center, whereas anyway, but we don't need to go into all that. We have planning units, so that's just how we're defining the study area to then figure out what do we need to, which of these cells do we need to set up an action for to conserve these species, or these features, I should say. And these principles, there's actually been quite a few acronyms over the years for conservation, but these are pretty good. Comprehensive, adequate, representative, and efficient. So, and it's care. It's how we care for the biodiversity we have. And comprehensive is really just the notion of how do we get all the species of interest, and not just 4 of the same. So it's really about like, how do we get biodiversity in the sense of species richness captured with what we're setting aside with some management action. And then, is it adequate? Are we getting enough area for that species to survive long term? So for instance, there was another initiative that Steve Gaines and others here at UCSB were quite involved in with the Marine Life Protection Act for California. And this is in the 2010s, I guess. And they set up these like rules of thumb about the minimum size that could maintain. So this is the California Marine Life Protection Act, and looking at marine reserve design. And they kind of came up with some ideas about what's the minimum size, like how big should an area be that we would want to, let's say, exclude fishing from, and then how far apart should these things be in order, for instance, larvae, which are most common for dispersal, to be viable, looking at overall population viability. So then we want to look at representative. So are we prioritizing like the endemics, meaning only like small range species that are only found within this one place, and rare species that maybe have some higher risk of extinction, and maybe representative in the sense that like it's representative of how many species we historically observed and want to maybe maintain or restore to. And then efficient is the idea is that we want to try to, it goes back to like, do we have a bunch of little scattered planning units across the entire study area, or can we lump them together into one place that's easier to manage and yeah, going to cost less in the end, and easier to to observe the management measures of. So if you have a bunch of little scattered reserve areas, then it's going to be a lot harder for people to navigate around. So this actually gets a little bit complicated when you start digging into this. And this idea of complementarity is kind of interesting, and we really need to look at this with by sequencing through. And the idea is that you might say, like, let's say these are these 4 different sites or planning units that you have, and initially you might get this one here because if it captures all the species you want, and you might start with the most species rich place or planning unit, and then go to the next one, and then the next one. So there's different strategies about how you maybe prioritize with richness, or you prioritize with rarity, and then you greedily add. But actually, this one turns out to be more efficient in that it's a smaller planning unit that we chose, and it still satisfies, you know, the notion of at least capturing one of everything for basic biodiversity. And so let's just walk through that and how you might do this selection. And we can also report out on all of these with any given solution, which is what you'll do in the lab. And there's quite a rich literature on just decision science. And actually, where I did grad school at Duke, there, I think they called the stats department statistics and decision science. So what is the goal? So what are we trying to achieve as far as representation of species conserved? How much of each of these things do you want to actually, how much of our targets do you want to conserve? And what things must our solution do to help achieve the goal? So what constraints do we have? Are some planning units already in a reserve? Are some planning units, like, let's say, a military base, and we know we can't, you know, buy that property and conserve it and do anything else? Or is there some other mild measure of conservation happening? And then what do we do? What's the actual management action? Not just what's the place, but then maybe even how things might be differentially, management actions might differentially contribute towards the goal. So there's this other program called Zonation that evolved from Marxan, and the idea was that maybe, let's say in a fishery sense, you could have a no take zone that allows no fishing, and then you maybe only have a recreational fishing take, and then maybe and then maybe like a full-blown fishing available. So yeah, the idea is that you want to tie it to actual action. Okay, so let's look at this as an optimization problem and step through it. And let's say that each of these green circles is a planning unit, and, or I might just call it a site too, just for one word simplicity. And then we see the species. So we got crabs, butterflies, lambs, elephants, and even a penguin. So the question is, well, which of these do we conserve? And if we establish a minimum number of islands that we want to use, and how many, what is a sufficient habitat for each species? And then the decision is, well, do we call that a reserve or not? So it would be a binary yes or no. Okay, so we'll number each of these sites, and And then we'll just put these down here in columns. And then we will complicated research legacy. Okay. Okay. Oh, cool. Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Julia. Yeah. Okay, so if we are trying to minimize the cost, let's say each of those sites costs €1. And so if as we add each of these sites to the overall network of reserves, then we impose an extra cost. So if we look at then the sites column-wise, and then the species row-wise, we can see that site 1 has, a butterfly and a crab. Site 2 has a crab, 3 penguin and a sheep, and so on. So here's where the distribution of our species versus our sites, which you guys have been seeing stuff like this already with the last set of labs, and then you see that we've got more than one for all of them, actually, or equal to, and we can use these different optimization softwares to use integer linear programming and get a result. And you might say that it's depending on how you go about this, you could say that I'm going to start with like the penguin one, and then pick this, and then yeah, I guess this is the optimal solution that gets the fewest number of sites that matches all the species basically. And yeah, so anyway, there's a better example. Yeah, that I had that looks at like greedily doing it, but the idea is that this is what you're trying to approve, and using this prioritizer software, you can get at this, at designing the goals, the objectives, constraints, and the decisions. So if you want to minimize the cost for each of the planning units, and then you want to maximize the benefit. So given that constraint of what's your budget for all of your planning units, how do you then maximize the target species that are in your solution, and including like rare species. And then you might have penalties that you can impose, like how much perimeter there is. So you want to get as big a blobs. And then there's even ways of ensuring that there's connectivity between other patches of habitat. So in the Marxan sense, that this used to be called the boundary length modifier. And you can see this is what I'm talking about, where you could have these like this scattershot approach. That's, as you can imagine, I think this is Bermuda or Bahamas, as that is very difficult to navigate. Whereas if you clump things together, so add a little penalty for extra perimeter, then you can get these more manageable chunks. That is probably going to be more area too, more planning unit in your budget. And then this is also looking in the Caribbean, and you might look at fishing intensity and work around that too, as like maybe could be a cost or it could be a target, depending on how you frame it. So yeah, what are you trying to conserve? how much of it, and what kind of action you're going to take. So previously, when I had did that high seas analysis, we used this Gurobi optimization engine, which is commercial and really expensive unless you have an academic license. In lab, and it's also really kind of complicated to set up software-wise with licensing. And in the lab, you're going to be using a different one called LP Symphony, which you can just install directly from R, and it works cross-platform. So the idea is that you feed in this biodiversity and economic and any other data layers that are part of your problem, and you input it into the solver, and it's trying to, minimize all the terms, solve it, and then you can generate maps and statistics out of it. So this is where prioritizer gets going. And the idea is that, yeah, you start with, okay, you've got the data, and then just the mental model. So before we actually code, this is like pseudocode. So we're working with data, and then objective, and then we're adding constraints, maybe penalties, what kind of decision are we making, and then what kind of solving engine are we going to use, and then we go ahead and solve it. And so this is the actual code to do that. And then that problem, we're feeding it, what are our planning units? What are the features associated with each of those planning units? What is our objective? Maybe it's just the minimum set of all features. Maybe we want to make it some percentage, so 10%, and then we could add some boundary penalty, so we get some clumping, and then it's a binary decision rather than just a bunch of different possible outcomes. It's whether it's in or out of the network, and then this is one of the solvers that gets used. So dplyr style problem creation, and then boom, solve. So this is like kind of like the fitting or the training step, and then and this is kind of like the prediction step, but not exactly. So this is yeah, it's an optimization problem, and this is a lot of what basically economists do all the time, is just trying to optimize, trying to minimize or maximize some cost function or utility function. So that's what this is doing. And we have these competing objectives with minimizing the cost, maximizing the diversity, and maybe minimizing the perimeter. So it's trying to solve for all of those at once. And the study area that you guys are going to use is Tasmania. So not surprisingly, the most worked up examples are in Australia, because this is really a down under origin. And we've got these little hexagons. They look prettier than just simple squares. And each of these has a certain number of, in this case, vegetation types. So you're given a raster stack of each of these vegetation types. And then for the sampling units, it then extracts like which of these are represented in each planning unit. So that's where we're looking at there. And then you can now design the problem. So here's our planning units. We have our features and a cost argument. And then if we just want to say get 10% and of all of the input features, this is then the output that we get for the solution. So all the little red squares. And then what we can also do is say, well, okay, let's account for what is already a protected area. And so we're going to lock in these sites, and then we get a different solution. So now we've just expanded the existing network. So these additional sites or planning units are then complementary to what's already being preserved in achieving our 10% of each target feature objective. And then we can lock out certain areas, like maybe, like I said, maybe these are military, or they're urban, or they have some other non-negotiable existing human use. So we say, look, we know that's not even on the table. Let's lock those out. We just locked in the existing conservation conserved areas. Now let's lock out the ones that we don't have a chance in actually conserving. So that would then produce a different set of outputs where we get this set. And so you can even see how it kind of like straddles this edge with these, but then, and we even get an island inside the locked out, but we don't get anything that was actually in that area. So like some of these little guys are actually in the what is locked out. So now we're turning on and off these different solutions by just filling out the problem space. And then finally we can add a boundary penalty. So these are things that a lot of times it's relative to your study area, how big a penalty, how that weight offsets some of the other objectives of your optimization problem. So in this case, you see that we go from this solution, and then by adding that penalty, it's actually accreting or adding planning units around that existing conserved area, because that ends up reducing the overall perimeter. So it reduces the amount of boundary that gets included as a penalty. So we have a more clumped than solution here. And then proportion decisions. Actually, I think I'm not, yeah, I don't think you guys are going to get to those two. So there are different ways of setting up the objective function. And I think for the rest, it's just a matter really of going through this lab, which thanks to Jeffrey Hansen doing such an awesome job with this package and with the documentation, I just cannibalized his existing stuff, reduced some of the text, and kind of streamlined some of the code so that it just automatically installs, and it even automatically downloads this data for your planning units with the vegetation raster stack. So, and then creates the so assuming you have this in an RStudio project on Taylor, it will create this directory, this dir data for a prioritizer. And we're gonna like check to see, does this file exist? And if not, go ahead and download this zip file, unzip it, and then look at all the files where it unzipped, move it back up into this, just the prioritizer folder, and then unlink or delete the zip file and that extra data folder that it unzipped it to by default. And then you start going into, okay, now let's actually start reading in that data. So we're going to read in this planning unit shapefile, which is just those hexagons. And then we're going to read in the locked out and locked in data. And then we're going to read in this vegetation TIFF as a raster stack. And so here we see the planning unit data as these hexagons, and it likes the older spatial SP polygon structure. So that's why we have a spatial polygons data frame. It's basically why we have this read SF and then as spatial converts it from the SF kind of native storage to the SP R package native storage. Anyway, hopefully in future, you guys will just use the SF because it's much more modern and easier to manage and tidyverse friendly. But anyway, this is what it looks like when you spit out a spatial polygons data frame. So it's just telling you what are the min max values. It's not like a Tibble looking thing, but here we've got an ID. So that's the planning unit ID. And notice here is a cost. And then we've got a locked in and a locked out fields that we explicitly grabbed as a logical, so as true, false. And so now each of these has a cost, and we're going to try to minimize that cost, but there's clearly some variability with each of these hexagons. And then you can run the map view this to get the interactive leaflet plot. And this is just yeah, I don't really much prefer the SF package, but it wants SP for this stuff to run. And then we have these slot names. So you might be used to using a $sign after like a data frame to access the column. And slots is just another way of kind of storing information, kind of like a list. But it uses this little @ sign. So PU data is this large object that contains like elements of things inside. And rather than using the $, use the @ symbol to extract it. So this is saying what is the projection. In this case, it's UTM, Universal Transverse Mercator. So anyway, this is in meters. So as opposed to geographic coordinates in decimal degrees. And that comes into play when you're looking at boundary. So you get true distance in meters as opposed to funky distance in decimal degrees that is actually an angular unit. So we got these 516 planning units. We can look at this cost, what's locked in, locked out. Okay, so this is our actual data. And so this is the planning unit object that it's kind of expecting out, and we can plot the cost. So here we see that things are less expensive. It's kind of a gradient over here, and then they get more expensive as we go from east to west, and a little bit as we go from south to north as well. And you can do that interactively with the map here too. So the cool thing about this lab is that you can, I'd like for you to try to answer these questions, and you can just copy this whole thing on Taylor from this path, and then save it into your own folder, and then add responses to these questions here, and that's forces you to start, evaluating what are these results, what do they mean, and then you can rock on with the vegetation data. So it's hard to see these little green dots, but they're for each vegetation data raster slice. There's little pixels describing the presence of the data. So this is just looking at that stack, and we see that there's a min and max of 0 and 1, and there's a sum for the maximum number for any given cell is 17. So there's of the 20, there's no pixel that has all 20, or excuse me, 32. There's no pixel that has all 32 vegetation types. The most that any given vegetation type has is 17. And then now this next section is looking at the gaps, like where is it that we have existing protection versus where we don't, and then what's the relative abundance of these things. So you can look at how abundance varies in a histogram, and just want to check that out. And then this is, now we get into the interesting stuff. So now actually doing the optimization. So I added this other bit here, which is because as you try to knit this stuff, this problem function from the prioritized package that's the time consuming thing. And so what I want to do is cache those results. So as maybe I'm changing the wording of something and I'm working in a different section, but I want to knit the whole document, I don't have to go back and rerun that thing. Now, if any of this stuff changes, then you would want to rerun this whole problem. So just be careful there. A lot of times, like in previous labs, I would add or, so which is a pipe character, and then redo. And I just have a little redo variable at the very top that says if it's false, then I'm just going to assume if I have a cache of that thing, that object, then use that. But if it's true, then I'm going to regenerate everything, take it from the top. So that's another way of handling this. So here, this is just setting a path, and it's taking that directory of data and then just adding this, and the file path just adds the separator in between. So this is the problem one, and RDS is like this, it's like this serialized object. So it's a little brittle if you have a very different version of R, but it's a great way to do some quick caching. So if that does not, so not meaning the little exclamation, if this file doesn't exist, then create it by actually solving for this problem with our input planning unit data, our vegetation data, and we're telling it where that cost column is in the planning unit data. And then meet the minimum set objective. So that's setting the objective. And we want 5% of each of those targets, those 32 vegetation types. So that's going to be relative to how much vegetation is in the total study area, right? So that's then representative of the original amount of vegetation. And this is applying it to all, the same rule to all, but you can also differentially apply it to account for rare or endangered species, or the fact that maybe it's very abundant in this little study area, but you're kind of concerned that it's very endemic and not found elsewhere. So you might want to change that weighting. And then binary decision, and then we're using this little LP symphony. So that's the solver engine to do that integer linear programming optimization. And then we're saving that object. So then next time we run it, if it does exist, so this has to evaluate to true for this to run. So this evaluates to false because it does exist. And then we just go ahead and read this in. So we don't have to regenerate that. And this will print out the problem. So you'll see more about that when you run it. And then we can solve that problem. And the solving actually runs pretty fast for these examples. So I didn't bother caching. And then we can print out, all right, so here's the solution. And we can look at, so in the solution, calculate the number of planning units selected. So in this case, we had 15 planning units selected, and you see them here. So this is solution one for all those planning units. And then now you're going to take that initial problem, and you're going to then go through a few more steps to then add complexity. So this one, now we're going to actually add in those locked in, like where do we already have conservation? So we're going to add this locked in constraints. And this is then going to be looking for a column in our planning unit data. This is locked in to a true or false, whether that's that planning unit is locked in. And then, yeah, here we get the other solution. And then this one, it's a 10% target. So now we're expanding from a 5% to a 10% target. So now we're getting more of this solution. And then this one is adding some locked out data, and as well as locked in, and we get a different set. And now we're going to penalize fragmentation. So here we're adding a boundary penalty, and you guys should play with this in the questions. You'll play with the different boundary penalties. And so that's pretty much a wrap. This has gotten like phenomenally easier than times past. So you guys are really lucky you didn't have this lab a couple years ago. Yeah, it's kind of cool. It's pretty fun. It's like a nice little topper of getting all the way to going from species to multiple species and communities, and then saying like, okay, now how do we have conservation action on top? And it's kind of this class of optimization that is a little different than some of the machine learning approaches that we've been using so far. Yeah. So I think at this point, that's all I had to say for conservation planning and using Prioritizer and this overall lab. I want to definitely open it up now to other questions and comments. And you'd start with this one. This looks interesting, Julia. I haven't seen this. Complicated legacy. So I also, you know what, there is this aspect. I included a link before we go into E.O. Wilson. On this slide, there is this. This is the Wikipedia entry for 30 by 30, and then this is the $5 billion promise, but it's not a perfect plan. And I'll just point out that there are concerns mentioned here over Indigenous rights issues. So there's some controversy there, and it's this kind of like classic, developed countries can solve all the problems for the developing world by throwing a lot of money, and there's a lot of power differentials, and then this is also kind of, oh no. Oh, I'll fix that link. Maybe this is, yeah, there we go. I'll fix this link. So yeah, there are some concerns about like basically accounting for more indigenous use and getting their input into these planning processes. So everybody needs to be at the table. And I don't know if, Julie, did you have any comments about this link you shared?
We don't have to go into it, but I know some of us in the meds program are wanting to have like a brown bag lunch about the colonial influence within science and how that's influenced a lot of the legislation or initiatives that are currently occurring, like the Half Earth Project, which is not taking into account Indigenous voices. But I did have a question about the class material.
Mm-hmm. ahead.
I was wondering if you knew if within this process, if there's a way to weight or prioritize for corridors or proximity to other preserves or areas, because proximity sometimes is important for specific species.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's this whole tutorial on connectivity, which kind of addresses a lot of that. But I would say that this is also an ongoing research topic, and it's pretty active in the literature with how to account for connectivity. Yeah. So I would say look at this this guy, and it can connectivity. We're going to talk about graph data structures when we go into deep learning, because it's basically what's called a graph, where you have nodes and edges, meaning there's like a topology, and connectivity. It can get even more complicated if you're looking at, say, marine systems, where you then have directionality between nodes. So depending on, let's say, dominant currents, you might have a source and a sink that where this, let's say, if you're looking at coral reef connectivity, that source could spawn, but it might only be a source. That source might it might not be bidirectional based on dominant current patterns. So connectivity can get quite complicated, but in terrestrial sense, it's usually, we don't consider that that directionality as much. And let's see if so this is doing like basically the data prep, and then this is neighbor constraints. So this is where it has that little extra constraint that you can add, looking at neighbors, and contiguity. So what is the difference between a neighbor and contiguity? Contiguity just means like something that's touching something else. These are extremely complex. Okay, so this is this is saying that the solution has to all be connected, and meaning that you're not going to have some disconnected island. And then linear constraints. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to go and remind myself of some of these different constraints, but connectivity penalties. So a lot of times too, you would describe the graph, like if you have different patches of what you deem habitat, you would then describe a graph as in like how things get connected from one patch to the other, and then the distance between, and then you feed that distance matrix, kind of like what you guys did last lab, in as part of the criteria with maybe some threshold value. Yeah, there's early on, years back, there's a Eric Tremmel was a PhD student in my advisor's lab, and he did this landscape ecology paper that really tried to address this, these connectivity issues in the ocean, looking at coral reefs, and is a really awesome paper years ago. And now this has just gotten like phenomenally easier to actually run and do. So if you have more specific examples to consider, or share with the class, I'm all ears. And maybe like that's a good point to also ask, where have you guys seen conservation planning applied, or even have some of you worked with this kind of process before? All right, sounds like this is a bit of a newbie thing for you guys to chew on, which is great. Yeah, these tutorials kind of go into more detail about other approaches. So these management zones, you can have different zones to meet different objectives. In this case, you see like these different solutions. So yeah, and then calibration. Because these things, these different objectives tend to compete with each other, you can play with these different costs associated with these, penalties, like the boundary length penalty, and then see how it behaves accordingly. So a lot of times folks will do some sensitivity analysis to look and see, given a range of values, how sensitive is my result to changing that range for any of those criteria. And
Cool, thank you for showing that.
Yeah, and lots of good stuff here.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
In your conservation planning experience, how often are these areas reevaluated based on like more recent estimates of species abundance?
That's a great question. I don't know. I'm trying to think of a good example where it's been reevaluated. You guys have probably seen things like the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, or there's a bunch of efforts that are happening like at an international level. These SDG, these 17 goals. So a lot of these, if there's ones for like life below water, life on land, and this is where you'll see like how are we doing as far as overall protection goes. And so that's a fairly common metric, because we have these different like 30 by 30, these different goals that we're trying to achieve. But I would say that doing a deeper evaluation of how well they've performed is not common enough. So it's the right question. Like years back, I was helping out with the database on this for this National Estuarine Restoration and River Restoration System, NERS, and that whole premise was that of this database was like to actually do follow-up and ask, well, how did that restoration effort go, and how many species got reintroduced? Was there a lot of times there's efforts to do initial restoration or efforts to do initial park designation, but then they're deemed like paper parks, where they're parks in name, but there's like mass deforestation happening there. and there's no, oversight. So that is the right question. And I think that increasingly we're going to be relying on these efforts to remotely detect status of conservation. And there was a guy years back I saw give a talk at NCs that was quite cool, where he really described like a 10-fold reduction in the like mid 2000s of Brazilian deforestation, massive reduction, because they use satellite imagery to look at on a parcel by parcel basis and evaluate how much of the parcel was deforested from times past. And they had strict property law that said thou shalt not deforest more than 20% of your property if you live in the Amazon. And they actually sent out local police enforcement and arrested people. And word got out, and there was a massive reduction. Now that's flipped with their current administration. It's pretty bad these days. But that kind of oversight, I think, is going to be increasingly used, and then other ways that we can efficiently detect species, like acoustically, and with environmental DNA. There are all these, more interesting techniques coming out that can provide low-cost solutions, and then we can more strategically figure out where we need to do more systematic surveys. But yeah, it's usually very expensive. That's been the limiting factor to go back and evaluate and do surveys for, like, now how much do we have? And it's a good question, because it should be done a lot more than it is. Usually there's a lot of enthusiasm at the outset of designating a park, and there's a lot less enthusiasm for maintaining it and evaluating it. Yeah. Okay, we got another question here. How eDNA could increase species presence density in and out of conservation areas?
It was just like a add-on to what Juliet was saying, and you just being able to detect species in areas with eDNA, and how that would maybe inform reprioritization or prioritization of protected areas.
It's an ongoing research topic. If you guys haven't heard of this technique, environmental DNA is just a way of sampling the environment. I'm most familiar with the marine environment, where they'll take a liter of water, push it through a filter, and then preserve that filter, like in liquid nitrogen, when they're out at sea, and then bring it back, and then amplify that. Use PCR techniques to amplify the DNA. And then there are these primers that then they look to see if the DNA strings match up. And those primers then get associated with these things called operational taxonomic units, OTUs, that then provide an indicator of what's there. And the thing is, eDNA, it's kind of amazing that there's genetic material just floating around in the water, and we're so good at detecting like the most minute amount that if it's even there, like we could amplify it and like be like, yeah, whales and fish and penguins live here. Like, wow, that's kind of, I think that's incredible. But it's not necessarily, it's so variable what you find, and it doesn't, you get a lot of false absence. But it's good for detecting like invasive species. That's where it's most successful. with like, I don't know, these invasive mussels or things like that. And actually, I was just talking about eDNA yesterday. I'm working with this California Coastal Ocean Fisheries Program and this MBON initiative. And here's like a little, I don't know if this one is still up. No. But I made a little visualization Shiny app for eDNA because bioinformatics is the term that got co-opted by the geneticists. So then it's ecoinformatics for everything else that's in the environment. They're really good at storing AGCTs and then analyzing the bejesus out of AGCT as far as like, genetic constituents, but they tend to do less when it comes to actually understanding like spatial temporal distributions of this stuff. So this is just a little app that could take a standard OTU eDNA kind of thing and then look at distribution of eDNA in space and in time. And so hopefully we'll expand upon that with this Cal Coffee project. Yeah. One of the guys that did the human genome is Craig Ventnor out of San Diego Scripps, and he has a whole sampling program for the oceans that I'll be hopefully working with. Yeah, but it's pretty cool stuff. Ooh. Zoo animals DNA out of the air. Like that, that's just so cool. I mean, gosh. Yeah, it's so cool. Yeah, we just slurp it out of the air. And yeah, I guess we're all too aware of like airborne particles these days, Yeah. Airborne DNA to track endangered species. How cool. Awesome. I love that. Yeah. So, yeah, they're good for detecting things that might otherwise be hard to find, I would say, especially if there's some sloughing of, material. It's genetic material, but there's no substitute for a systematic survey where you actually go and count things and systematically do it. So, yeah, but this is getting cheap enough to do now that why wouldn't we implement this more commonly? So yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's really cool. Oh, that was just a couple weeks ago. Love it. Yeah. Okay, well, I'll add this to the Slack too, just so we have that for posterity. Yeah, and then I'll go ahead and just kick around if there's specifics. And some of you guys have had some issues with knitting things, so you're welcome to share a screen. We can look at it, and unless there's any other comments or questions.
I have a question, Ben. This is sort of more logistical. I know we're going to review content for the midterm on Monday, and I really appreciate that. Could you give us a little bit more of an overview on like what we can expect in terms of how it's going to be set up and what types of questions it's going to be, just in case we're doing any reviewing over the weekend?
Yeah, I mean, it's really just meant to point to like what's the big picture here of what you guys have been learning about, and I'll be just I'm going to be focused on like those processes of fitting and predicting and evaluating, and then things like terms like ROC and AUC. What do those mean? And what, decision trees and what are the different logistic techniques. So it's everything you guys have been doing, and I'm not trying to, there's no trick questions that'll be there. It's just more a matter of wanting to make sure that you guys understand the landscape. And something that this has prompted me to think about is really like maybe a decision tree for, you know, where you're at in your analysis and what kind of data you have and how it, like how each of these things might factor into it. So I don't know if I'll get there. I might look for some others, but yeah, it's like, are you just looking for something that's predictive? Or are you looking for explanatory? And I will review also the papers that I assigned and what I think are the salient points in them. I mean, I didn't always talk about them explicitly, but you know, like I used actually the figures for like this last one, the figures that I used to describe in the lecture slides were actually came straight from this chapter. So I felt like that chapter gives you more background on what those things mean. And so I will include the readings, like this Elith and Leithwick one is a really good one. And then I'll review what those terms are that I think are important on Monday. And it's just, you know, making sure that you just like understand the most basic big picture things with this, so that when you go then to apply this for, let's say, your capstone project, or you're working for some organization in the future, you have the beginning of a, like, you know what to Google. Like my brain doesn't retain most of this stuff, but I have like a few search terms that are stuck in my head, and then I can like kind of map the landscape. So I don't really expect people to retain like how to code everything, but, or how to, you know, every little detail, but it's like you need enough to know what to look for, and then where that thing fits into the context of the available analytical tools and preparatory steps, and then evaluation steps. So that's all I'm going for. This is really just like this is a check-in to be like, hey, did you capture some understanding about this stuff? And I think, you know, points wise, it's pretty, it's like, it's only 10 points. So it's only worth half the species lab and only one of the other labs. So definitely don't sweat the midterm. I'm not trying to throw curveballs. It's really just going to be a pretty big picture overview of what we talked about, and make sure that these points stick, and then you have a place in your brain to kind of like put this information so that you're, you know, useful into the future.
And does it cover lab 2 material or just lab 1?
It will cover everything that we have done to date, meaning all of this stuff before the midterm. So yeah, everything that I've said to date, including today, and assigned, including the readings, will be included. Because I included a lot more material to reference in the last lab, I'm not adding readings to that, so it's a lighter load on the reading side. But yeah, that's what's inclusive. And then the idea is that we kind of like close that first half of the class saying like, okay, we've gone from species to communities to reserves. And in the process, we've also learned about supervised learning, where we actually have a response term, presence or absence. And then we've gone on to unsupervised learning, where we did clustering and ordination. And then we did some optimization with doing this multi-objective reserve planning. And that's sort of like a good, really first chunk of stuff to know before then we go into a fairly different kind of an an animal, although we actually have the same fit, predict, evaluate steps. The structure of neural nets and the features or the predictors, it's a little bit more involved, and so it's like a bit of a different animal that is gaining a lot of traction as long as you have a lot of data. And then we'll do this Google Earth Engine. So it's like, yeah, I like to kind of like bookend, what we've done to date, and then kind of move on to another kind of like set of modules that is really useful in today's world.
Ben, I may have missed this, but for the test, is it going to be like written short answer? Is it going to be like a computer thing?
Yeah, well, I partly was like waiting to see what our status was with online versus not. I mean, I'm gonna say like no communication with each other, but I think it's gonna be. It looks like we're gonna be in person, so that's great. But I also don't believe that you should have to retain everything in your head, and I kind of like just being able to access stuff on the computer. So if I can manage to get all the questions digitally input, then I'm gonna do that, and it'll be like short answer or multiple choice. That's pretty much the format. Yeah. I'm hoping I can do like some kind of fun mix and match with like some drag and drop, like take these set of elements and associate it with this set of analysis. But I have to play with that to see if I can actually get that to work. Yeah. Okay, did anybody want to go over specific like bugaboos that they're having? I can kick around for a few extra minutes too. Hey, does it looks like you're last man standing here.
I think Charles is there. Charles, do you have a specific question? I have more of a generic question. All right, sure. I can go ahead. So mine is more related to like sort of the bigger picture, because I'm thinking about like applying all the things that we learned in a different context.
Okay.
More in the context of our capstone project, which is based in renewable energy siting. So a lot of the stuff that we've been doing, I see it being applicable in that context. But one thing I'm kind of having trouble understanding is like we sort of work through all these different ways to sort of identify which variables are contributing the most, and then we did like the general additive modeling and then the generalized linear modeling. So I just wonder how that all like sort of fits together and like when you would choose in the real world to like choose one over the other.
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, there was two modules where we did these very different techniques. One with logistic regression and then one with decision trees.
Yeah.
And if we just look at logistic regression,
Yeah.
There was we went from GLMs to GAMs to Maxent. And
Yeah.
so
Right.
so this is, I would say, increasing levels of being able to fit the model. If you're interested, and this goes to, if you're interested most in just straight up prediction that is going to be most like accurate, then you would allow for Maxent probably.
Okay.
But if you're interested in something that's maybe just more explanatory, where you're trying to understand like what is the relationship in a like maybe an ecological sense, then you might look at like a GLM if it is explanatory, or a GAM. And what I didn't really talk about is how to restrict the knots. Like when I was initially doing a lot of predictive modeling of whales and dolphins, and working with other ecologists, they really did not like seeing a whole bunch of wiggle because it didn't make any ecological sense. So I would restrict, you could do this thing where you could actually just say K equals 5. And that's like the number of knots that I have. Only 5 different inflection points were allowed in the GAM.
Okay.
And so that allows you to have like a prominent niche, you know, of like some optimum that it tapers off, and then it can also taper off without like flaring out on the ends by having 5 knots. You can also replicate this, and this is the kind of thing like I'd love to go back and flesh out the labs more, because you could do this other thing here where you could say altitude, and then you can say give that to me squared. And if you do that, then you can actually have this, if this is a positive coefficient that gets fit to this term, and then this is a negative coefficient, then initially when that value is small, that positive coefficient, I think I flipped it. Anyway, it can basically, you can have a peaked
versus, positive. Essentially.
You can have a peaked where you flip the sign on those coefficients, you can get a peaked form back. And you can keep adding polynomial terms to basically replicate what the GAM does. So that might be also another way. And the point is that like that requires a lot more construction to do that manually in a GLM. So a lot of times people will do things like, maybe they'll start with a GAM to explore the space and then kind of restrict the knots. And then, you know, if they're looking for something explanatory, or they'll just go straight to like, let's say Maxent. And then the recursive partitioning, you know, when would you want to use that? Well, random forest is the other technique that is most commonly used. And that tends to do well in just this straight predictive capacity. Like if you don't really care about as much interpreting where those breaks occur. But recursive partitioning, it's similar to like, you know, the R-part technique is not, it's a little bit more explanatory and less predictive, basically.
Gotcha. So the
in terms of
Maxent
the
is more
EDS paper.
similar to the random forest type, like in terms of application, because you're focusing more on the predictive. Okay, and then like GLM versus GAM would be like how you would want to start it. I mean, that's similar to how our pilot study was done, is like use the GLM to like sort of get the explanatory variables and then move forward. So I was just thinking about it in that context. Okay, cool.
Yeah, and a lot of times the GAM would be used to like be like, okay, what are the relationships? The GLM tends to, unless you add those extra terms, it can be, and there's already a linear relationship. It can be hard to fit. You don't get very good results if it's, you know, peaked or nonlinear and or wiggly in other ways.
Gotcha.
But let's see. I just saw this yesterday. Allison.
Yeah, I think we just went live.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have it's the same concept as like the species distribution modeling that we're applying. Essentially, we have all these spots where wind and solar power plants are,
Mm-hmm.
and then what our client did is she took all these places where you could have solar and wind, and like generated random absence points, um, and then sort of took that, um, and then she just tried to figure out the explanatory variables, which is like we're gonna refine, and then using that she also did she did like a random forest to like predict the build out distribution in the West Coast.
Okay.
So she was talking about also doing like a geographically weighted regression, and then like even using like maybe Maxent to see if that improves stuff. Um, and then I was also thinking about, I mean, this is way out of our scope probably, but like what you presented today was super cool, because I was thinking about a situation where we have all the prior analysis done, like in terms of the explanatory variables, and then having like sort of these, we have these raster stacks, and then we could feed that as like, we have raster stacks for all of our explanatory variables, and what we could do is we could feed that into like what you presented today, like the prioritizer, and then we could set like a renewable energy like target or like capacity, and then feed in like certain conditions, and I don't know if that would work, or but like just give that a shot to see if you can get like sort of suggested like areas for development within like a certain state or area. Yeah.
Well, I'll be honest, Essek.
Yeah.
I love the enthusiasm with applying these all the techniques,
Yeah.
but I don't think it's like it might be overkill for what you're trying to solve, in the sense that, the optimization problem that that prioritizer package it's really useful when you have multiple objectives that you're trying to simultaneously meet. In the case of different species, but it's good to think about like audience, and then and what's the actual eventual use of this. So if you can create something that policymakers and energy developers can look at and be like, okay, these are the most viable places, that's probably the most useful. If there's some entity that's like, okay, like let's say the federal government says we have $5 billion we're ready to spend on a constellation of renewable energy, and we want to get different energy targets, and we have one lump sum to spend, then maybe what I was talking with today would be applicable. But I would just caution against using tools that aren't, addressing your most fundamental question.
Right. Fundamental questions. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing that I didn't really talk about, but should have more with all those techniques, was the fact that we were just using logistic regression, and the response term was just 0 or 1. But in this case, you might actually want to, and the underlying distribution is a binomial, meaning 0 or 1. But in this case, you might want to be like solving for like what is the most useful, kind of thing. So you might have a more continuous response that you're trying to fit, and it seems like you want to I'm working in the renewable energy in the marine realm.
Yeah.
And so we could, there's a few ways of approaching this, right? There's like the energy availability, and then there's the like the other conditions, whether it's existing human uses or environmental concerns, that could be constraints. So you're generally doing like trade-offs between the two.
Right.
So like this paper that I had was in a little Shiny app to go with it. It's here. I don't know. Oh, weird. I can't hit send because, oh. Okay, there we go. Yeah.
Cool.
So this guy, and I'll just talk through some of this because the image isn't working there anymore. So in this case, the idea was, and this is more detailed than I think that you guys need or are doing.
Yeah.
But the idea was to, okay, we've got wind profitability. There was this this natural capital group out of Stanford that came up with a model that describes like, here's how much profitability you get given this wind amount, like this amount of wind resource. And then we have environmental sensitivity concerns about seabirds and them colliding or avoiding. And then we can evaluate each pixel based on a trade-off between those two. So that's like one way of kind of approaching it, is like, okay, so there's a trade-off. This is some of these things are kind of like societal values and that we place on like how much are we going to promote renewable wind. Like the Audubon Society is saying we support renewable energy, including wind turbines. We just want you to do it in responsible places and have some other measures in place, like a lockdown during migration times or something. So there's ways of like approaching these are like multiple competing things to sort out. And it's kind of cool to be like, okay, well, you could do something like a weighting app. You could imagine an objective function that's trying to minimize all of these constraints, but it's based on the value of how much you want to weight profitability, let's say, versus sensitivity to certain species. So that's another way of kind of thinking about it.
Yeah. So we're actually trying to like get a survey from like renewable energy developers regarding like what they sort of value or think are like the most important factors, and then we're gonna try to see if we could somehow feed that into what we're doing, to see what the kind of trade-offs or like decisions they'll be making. So
Great.
yeah, I just wanted to pick your brain a little bit just to see what we can do.
Yeah, and then there's another cool visualization that with this Halpern 2012 that we had with this Ocean Health Index. We called it an Aster Plot. So, whoops, not that one, but this one. So this is just an area weighted average. So you could imagine that the scores for each, let's say, pixel in your analysis might change based on how much weight you put on any of those factors. And in this case, there are these, we have these different goals for sustainable oceans. And the preservationist is going to weight carbon storage and coastal protection and clean waters more than the extractive kind of perspective, which is going to be weighting like natural products and fisheries more strongly. And so it's kind of a way to like have a conversation between these different stakeholders about how to approach this. And this is something that I'm applying now to for a small business innovation research grant with the Department of Energy, because they want to engage in communities for offshore wind in particular, and have like more data informed conversations. And that's where it's good to like differentiate between this being a decision support tool versus a decision making tool. It's like these, depending on how you tweak the dial, you can get these different results, but that's not a bad thing. That's like, it's just the way, it's just the fact that we need to have a conversation about how we weight these things and what's important. So you might approach it in that way. It's just like, hey, you know, we have all these layers.
Yeah.
And you could look at like maybe past precedent. How do those layers interact, like predict or not, you know, your past precedent. And as you maybe even change different weights to them. So yeah, it's like maybe your solution changes.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. Could you send me that link as well to the ocean health one?
Yeah, and there's a, I mean, this is a really simple weighted average, but just visualized in this, this like little way.
Yeah,
And
it's super eye-catching and effective, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, this is Aster D3. This is the little JavaScript way of kind of programming it under the hood.
Awesome. Yeah.
And there's a R function out there in the OHI package too to do it. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I just wanted to get some insights from you, and this is very helpful.
Yeah, I'd love to keep chatting about this stuff and see how you guys are. Who is the client that did this initial analysis they were speaking about?
Grace Wu. She's an ES professor.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, well, and then you guys are trying to extend this to.
Yeah, it's right now it's there for 11 states, and we want to extend it to the US for 50 states. So I'd imagine that like most of our work's gonna be like the data cleaning and like sort of managing that, because it's gonna be all over the place and it's gonna be a lot of data. So we're gonna have to split it up into chunks and sort of run it that way. But yeah, should be fun.
Yeah, there's also there's a lot out there on these topics. So yeah, maybe does she have a paper on this already?
It's like about to get published sometime later this year, so it's in the pipeline.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, really interesting. I'd love to chat more with you guys about this. See,
yeah, for sure. Yeah,
as you
I'll
progress.
make sure to pick your brain whenever you can. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm writing this proposal, so maybe I can pick your brain too.
For sure.
And,
for sure.
Yeah, I'm gonna meet with some, like we need to outreach with communities and get their say. So like the whole values thing is like a little bit more on the forefront of my brain.
Gotcha. Nice.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. All right. Awesome. Look forward to touching base later, Desik.
Hey, Ben, I had a super quick question, just so I don't take away any less time from your day. But I was just wondering if you had any experience working with the Benioff Ocean Initiative.
Yeah. Yeah, they're awesome.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm applying to a data analyst position for them, and I just wanted to see specifically for their whale safe program. And I just wanted to see if there was any like machine learning applications that they were using in any of the programs that you've worked with them with.
Yeah. So this analysis was with the Benioff group.
All right.
Yeah. So this was Doug McCauley is the PI, you know, and Mark Benioff, he is the CEO of Salesforce. So he's like, I don't know, top 40 richest guys in the world or something like that. and he really likes the ocean. So he donated, like, I forget, it was $5 or $7 million to Benioff, and they set this up to basically like figure out grand challenges with the oceans. And the way they did with this process was they solicited people for ideas. And the first idea was this I haven't seen these other ones, actually. It's interesting. The first idea was this reducing whale ship collisions. So yeah, that's the whale safe. And I have been involved in, yeah, there I am, involved in streamlining the ship data to then go into the whale safe. So this is using a BigQuery, which is like a database by Google, to then grab the data. And so there's a lot of SQL in this. There's also these other layers, like the blue whale model, which there's not, I guess blue whales aren't like cruising through there at the moment. But this blue whale model is this other group at in Monterey builds out a blue whale model like this that's time dependent, and yeah, it's a really cool project. We're trying to apply this now to all other areas where ships are being voluntarily asked to slow down, and then evaluating like how are they doing, like a blame and shame, or a praise and blame kind of dashboard of who's doing well, who are good and bad actors. So you can see like letter grades, like these guys are doing great, get an A.
These guys are doing terrible.
Terrible. They're like not cooperating at all, not slowing down for whales. So the more they slow down, the less lethal it tends to be. So yeah, it's a really cool little project, and
Awesome.
It's a great group. Yeah, I highly recommend them. Like Doug is
Awesome.
amazing.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, he's truly amazing. He's like, yeah, such a great guy and brilliant and super nice and just really dynamic team, and yeah, they're great.
Awesome. Well, that's good to hear. I was like I'm like, there's gotta be some connection there, because a lot of the work that you've been talking about with whales in the Santa Barbara Channel, I was like, all right, there has to be a connection there. But yeah, thank you for showing me that. It was just kind of a quick question. I'm sure I'll have some more info that I might need a little advice on a little bit later. But yeah, that's cool. And thanks for showing me that. And yeah, I hope you've been getting some waves recently. It's been pretty fun.
Oh man,
hard to,
yeah. I haven't been like I need to. Yeah, I've been missing it. But did you guys went out to the Channel Islands? Like it went over the summer when I saw you guys. You were about to do a trip. How did that go?
That was amazing. So I've never been out to the Channel Islands. And Jake, he's a big fisherman, so he's got it's a decent sized boat, really seaworthy.
Oh, cool.
And he offered to take us out to gosh darn it, I think they call it like Marmetta or More Meadows.
Yeah, More
Meadow. Yeah. And
one.
anyways, we went out there on a pumping south swell, and we just scored. It was just really good waves. Not too crowded in the morning because we went when the tide was a bit higher, so a lot of people didn't show up till it got lower, and yeah, it was just such a fun time. And then we went fishing afterwards and got some fish for fish tacos that night. It was just an all around pretty awesome day. But going out there was one of the better parts, because I knew that the way the Santa Barbara Channel kind of works with, like, there's certain areas where like the bathymetry causes more upwelling, but right on the lines, and Jake was showing us, I believe would it be sonar that shows the bottom contours, or I don't know. Anyways, like right along those lines, we'd see just like huge packs of dolphins, like hundreds, it seemed like, just like all working together to get these fish, but like very specifically along these like lines where there's more upwelling. We saw a couple whales when we were going back, actually quite a few. But yeah, just totally opened my eyes to how alive the ocean is around here. But yeah, that was an awesome trip. I'm always gonna remember that.
Oh, that's amazing.
And Connor came along too, so that was awesome, and his brother.
Oh, good.
And
good.
Steven too. Yeah, it was a whole med crew that went out there actually.
Wow, that's so great.
Yeah.
And what was the A-frame really working? So you're getting lefts and rights?
Yeah. So I mostly rights, but there was a couple lefts when it got more crowded. I went over there. It was just like, it was almost so long period that the lefts were kind of closing out, and the rights were just like, it had to be the right angle. Like a lot of them would like just be a little bit too fast for the right, but you know, in the morning I would consider it very good waves. But yeah, it was awesome, and definitely a good place to have checked off the list. And I know there's a lot more waves out there, but yeah, that was a really good time. And yeah, nothing much more to say, but yeah, that it was fun. And me and Connor got some pretty fun waves down at Little Rincon. Me and Matt, his housemate. I haven't gotten down to Rincon during this well because it's just a little bit too crowded for me. But yeah, so brutal. Just wanted to see what you're up to. And yeah, thank you for showing me the Benioff Ocean Initiative. I'm definitely really interested in their work. So hopefully I can get my application in and see if I get the position. But yeah, thank you, Ben. And have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, you too, Charles. So glad you got it good out there. It's pure magic. It's just like, it's such a spectacular experience and a gem of in our own backyard. So yeah, really cool.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, have a great day,
Have
Charles.
an awesome.
Talk to you later.
All right. You too.